Hi, I'm Mike Peel from DevCon, and I'm here with Mark Lassoff of LearnToProgram Media. He's the owner and co-founder of that organization, and he's going to be talking about PhoneGap today. So let's start with the simple stuff. What is PhoneGap, and why might an Android developer be interested in it?
Sure, Michael. Well, PhoneGap is a cross-platform library that allows you to use HTML5, JavaScript, CSS, and whatever backend technology you choose to create mobile applications that can be distributed to just about any mobile platform, including Android and all of its derivatives. PhoneGap is a tool set that actually is produced by Adobe, but it's also got an open source cousin known as Cordova. So when I talk about PhoneGap, I'm kind of also talking about Cordova at the same time.
So what are the main advantages or disadvantages of using PhoneGap as opposed to just building an app natively?
Sure. Well, there's a number of advantages. The first one is the usage of familiar tool sets. Loads of people already have the HTML5, JavaScript, and CSS experience used to build, to build web-based apps. That can easily be parlayed into the mobile environment and building PhoneGap-based apps. Ease of distribution would be another strong benefit in that you can quickly distribute your application to a number of different platforms, including Android, but the same app can also be distributed to the iOS ecosystem, to Amazon's Kindle ecosystem. There's even ways of distributing apps as Chrome apps or to the television video types of apps that are being produced today. So it's a build once, distribute many times kind of environment. So that can save you a lot of time and budget in that, you only have to develop the app once. You don't have to port from Swift to Java, for example, or vice versa. Once you build the HTML5 app, essentially PhoneGap becomes a wrapper around the app to allow for ease of distribution. Now that does come, as you mentioned in your question, with a couple of disadvantages. The first is the entire hardware set for in the libraries doesn't exist. You can't access things such as Bluetooth or near field communication with your apps. So for certain hardware intensive mobile applications, PhoneGap isn't an option. Disadvantage can be performance and speed because you're essentially operating within a wrapped browser environment. That's obviously not going to be as fast as running mobile apps. But if you're not running the type of app where speed is of the essence, then that really doesn't matter too much to you. So those are the main advantages and main disadvantages, although there's probably dozens of others that people watching can think of.
Okay, so I have a question from the field. So what are the security aspects and features apart from SEA Android-based features to be mindful about while using PhoneGap or cross-platform development in general?
So, the basics of web security are, necessary for PhoneGap-based apps because you are essentially, again, really working within a web browser. So if you're working within a web browser, then you've got to have, the basics of securing your forms against SQL injection and other things that are kind of necessary in any web-based app that you might create. So that would be, I think, the first thing. The second thing is to use the security environment that's included in PhoneGap itself. PhoneGap's security environment mirrors the native security environment on the devices. So, for example, the permissions-based structure that exists on Android, where the user has to grant permission for you to access, for example, the camera or the address book or other features, that also is available in PhoneGap, but you do need to configure it correctly. So, those are kind of the basic things. Use your basic web security skills, and secondarily, make sure that you use the existing PhoneGap security schema in order to secure your apps as well as you can.
So PhoneGap is entirely web-based, or is HTML5? What is...
So PhoneGap, when I say web-based, what I'm saying is it's actually a web app that runs within a closed environment that is PhoneGap. PhoneGap basically provides a non-configurable, invisible web browser that displays your app. So an HTML5 JavaScript-based app is going to work in that environment, but the user doesn't have the standard browser controls. As a matter of fact, I think one of the goals is really to produce apps where the user doesn't know that they're in the PhoneGap environment and that they're really, it feels and works just like a native app. And that certainly is possible and likely if you code your apps well and really work within kind of the display, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of the aesthetics of mobile, but just integrated into kind of this PhoneGap environment.
Well, it seems like aesthetics and design are becoming more standardized because of the amount of cell phone usage out there or smartphone usage out there. So with sometimes as much as 50% of user base for whatever product or app you're talking about being on mobile, it seems like design is becoming a little bit more centralized in general. Would you agree?
I think design, good user interface design can still be creative user interface design. I've definitely seen innovative Android apps that are usable that depart from what are, kind of the traditional standards of how how mobile apps, quote unquote, should look. So I think, we still need to be creative and do good design, but we need to do within this kind of confines of the mobile space. And one of the things about running apps and developing apps in PhoneGap is you're again having to worry about multiple screen sizes. Where and that's true with the Android environment in general. Your apps are going to be run on multiples of screen sizes. You're going to have the low DPI, the medium DPI, etc. But now also, we talk about the 10-foot experience and people experiencing these apps on their television within the Android ecosystem. So, I think design has to become not more constricted, but more flexible to really allow for all of the different environments in which users are going to be consuming these apps. I think, it was easy in 2007, when all of this was starting 8-9 years ago, because, there was the iPhone and there was a couple of Android devices and we knew kind of the screen dimensions and we just worked within that context. But now we have everything from 4K screens on down, and really I think our users expect that the design is going to look correct, organized, and be usable across the spectrum of device sizes.
Well, you mentioned the 10-foot experience, so like the difference between what I call lean back and lean forward computing. Is there any, how are you able to tell the difference between 1920 1080 on a phone and that same dimension on a television for the app to adapt? Is that possible?
Well, I think it is. It's part psychological and part technical. There's a psychological difference when people are consuming app-based content on their television. They expect a more television-like experience. And while the pixel depth may be the same, the actual size of those pixels is going to vary quite a bit from screen to screen. So the way you would design from a television with someone sitting 10 feet away versus the way you design for a laptop with someone 2 feet away or a phone with someone 1 foot away is still going to differ, aside from having the same pixel dimensions. The other thing is you have to think about is the way someone interacts in the 10-foot experience. You don't get up from your seat and touch the screen like you would on a tablet or phone. You're going to be using some type of device to mediate that experience. So some of the things we're seeing now, it's a really very basic one, where we have touch and long touch in the Android world. We don't have that. We basically are going back to kind of a click style of interaction.
Yeah,
so
elements have to be highlighted, right? So like if elements would have to be highlighted, like if you're using a remote, because on the phone there's no need for highlight. The touch is
Correct.
the
Yeah. Correct. Yeah. That's that, and that's just one of the differences, and that's one of the most glaring differences. But there are dozens of others between the way people interact and what their expectations are for a television-based experience versus a mobile-based experience.
Before you were talking about how PhoneGap runs on the system. Is there any extra tasks to the system, basically running a web app like that?
No more than there would be for running any website or web application within the existing browser application on the device. It's not where you can overload with resources is, of course, because you're using a browser, elements are stored within the browser's DOM or document object model. So it is possible, for example, to have too many listeners that aren't being removed, or too much multimedia that really doesn't necessarily overload the device capabilities, but can have a detrimental effect on the DOM and the number of DOM interactions that are occurring. So PhoneGap apps generally will perform fine, but the same points in which you see slowdowns in web apps and poor performance in web apps are going to be the areas where you see poor performance in PhoneGap apps. And generally it's because you're tying up too many deep DOM requests at the same time because the application isn't well engineered.
So one of the big things this year has been battery life, and battery shaming has been part of Google's strategy. So would PhoneGap have access to the new Doze features, or is that not within its capabilities?
PhoneGap, and you're getting a little far afield of my expertise
Sorry.
here. If memory serves, PhoneGap does have a library or extension, I should say, that does give you access to status-based elements in the operating system like battery life. I'm not sure specifically about the Android library you're talking about, but I know there are ways of accessing status-based elements like battery life within the PhoneGap environment. Don't forget that everything PhoneGap is done in PhoneGap has to be operationalized for not just Android, but also for iOS and other operating systems that are out there. So what you wind up with is kind of a perhaps more generic feature set that's going to work cross-platform versus having access to kind of these very specific libraries in Android or iOS or Kindle or any other environment in which PhoneGap operates.
So what are some great types of apps that can take advantage of that streamlined PhoneGap development environment?
I think, any app that's a typical CRUD app where you're creating records, updating, deleting, etc., any type of record-based app, master detail apps, all do really well within the PhoneGap environment. I think, where you've had a long heritage of web-based apps and you're now porting over to mobile is probably the strongest argument for using PhoneGap because of the portability, the ability to very quickly move from the web environment and even reuse some of the code to the mobile environment. I still recommend, as I would with traditional apps, is that you build an API-based backend and then query the API and leave a lot of the hard, heavy lifting off of the app architecture itself into either the cloud or some type of server system that you have backing up your particular app. I never thought mobile devices were meant to do heavy computing. So we always, want to leave that off to the cloud or cloud servers, and that's especially true, I think, of web-based apps or PhoneGap-based apps because you're already in that environment. So using jQuery or JavaScript to interact with a RESTful service is very, very easy and just can be accomplished in a few lines of code. So I think where you're doing that type of thing, PhoneGap is strongly indicated. Where I start recommending that you go native is, again, where speed is really of the essence. So if you're looking at apps like video games, where you're very concerned about the number of animations on the screen at any given time, or the number of the sounds you have access to and things like that, that's really a time to go native, along with strong hardware interaction. So if you're using near field communication, Bluetooth, but that's not to say that the hardware isn't available in PhoneGap. One of the examples we'll be doing in the DevCon show is use of the inboard accelerometer on an Android device through PhoneGap. So, some of the hardware, most of the hardware is completely available to you. Geolocation, for example. You can interact through the operating system with the contacts database in Android. So there's a lot you can do, but certainly for more applications that are making more use of the hardware itself, might be a time to look at native development.
You had mentioned before we even started the broadcast that sometimes also playing to your personal skill set is important. Why do you feel that way?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you are already a web developer and you are strong in HTML5, JavaScript, and CSS, going back and learning Java plus the Android libraries in order to work with Android is going to be an uphill climb, is going to require more time and effort, a learning curve, where perhaps you could build the app more effectively using the skills you already have in the PhoneGap library. JavaScript is becoming more and more common as not just a front end, but also as a back end language with Node.js. So your ability to take those existing skills and parlay them into mobile is really, really enhanced. So if you have a set of existing skills that are compatible with PhoneGap or Cordova, that may be a direction to explore. In our own programs where we teach web and mobile development, we actually go through the whole PhoneGap-based development scheme before we touch native, because we've spent time building HTML5 and JavaScript skills, and we want people to maximize their use of those. And I would say a second thing, we keep, as an industry, moving towards and away from standards. HTML5, JavaScript all provide strong and tested standards that now, are going on their third decade. So I think, the ability to employ standards is going to help us, especially as the hardware environment continues to diversify and get more messy. Those standards are something that are going to keep development, I think, convenient and possible as the hardware environment continues to become more diverse.
So is there any way to, let's say you built your basic app with PhoneGap. Is there any way to drill down from that and then say, all right, we're going to use these features of Android if it's loaded on Android, or these iOS features if it's loaded on iOS?
There is. You can build modules. And if you build modules, what you're building is basically a JavaScript side in which talks to the specific Java code in the case of Android, to perhaps access a function that's not readily available through PhoneGap. So I could conceivably, for example, if I wanted to use near-field communication, build a Java hook using native Android development, hook into it with the JavaScript on the PhoneGap side, and access that feature specifically on Android devices. So there is a modular architecture that makes that possible. However, if you're going to do that, you probably should look strongly at going native to begin with, because that's I wouldn't say kludgy, but probably more inconvenient and complex method of getting something done that could be readily done with existing Java libraries in the current Android architecture.
Great. Is there anything you wanted to add in closing, a wrap up of anything we haven't touched about PhoneGap?
The only thing I would say is, this is a platform that's being invested heavily in, and I think that is going to continue to grow over the coming years. And I think it's a part of the skill set that everyone should have. But even if it's just for building MVPs or prototypes, I think people will find that PhoneGap is extremely user-friendly, extremely easy to use, and you can get started in just a few minutes. By a couple of lines of command line interaction, and then off you go in a very familiar environment with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. It's not the solution to every problem, but it certainly is an excellent way to build apps, and increasingly we're seeing more and more good apps built using the stack.
You know what, that just brought up another question to mind. As far as the importance of cross-platform development going forward, how important do you think it is that the average app be developed for cross-platform deployment?
I think it's extremely important, and right now we're almost in a a kind of an environment where we have two major competing operating systems. But what if a third comes around, or a fourth? What if we have to support, what if BlackBerry makes a surprising comeback? So now we're building 3 native apps. And then if you want to support the 10-foot experience on television, you're building 4 native apps. So, at what point do we say, okay, this is too much of a tax on our resources, when we could build a cross-platform solution quickly, easily, using familiar technologies that will work across the spectrum of devices, screen sizes, and any other kind of iteration of difference that you can think of. So, I think cross-platform is going to become increasingly important because devices are continuing to diversify. Some people will watch this interview on their phone, others on their tablet, some will watch on their laptop, still others will watch through the YouTube app on their television. So, as we continue to kind of extend the meaning of app, diversity becomes really a fairly difficult thing to manage. So, I think as we continue to have to manage diversity, we'll do you have to pay the light bill there, Michael?
I have to tell you
as we continue to have to manage diversity, cross-platform becomes an increasingly attractive option.
Great. I think that is absolutely true as the environment changes. So I just wanted to let the viewers know who lasted this long that there's a chance to get a free ticket to AndDevCon. If you go to andevcon.com/cross_platform_development, sign up there, and maybe you could come to AndDevCon and see Mark for free. Also, we're going to be doing another one of these AMAs next week, October 28th, with James White on Espresso, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So stick around for the link. We'll post it on the page. And then any continued questions, Mark has agreed, if you post them on the event page, that he'll try to check around every once in a while and maybe possibly answer them. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It was great. And thanks again, Mark.
Thank you.